Hi, and welcome to Balance by Design. Today I'm going to be talking about identity. It's the end of the school year, and I'm transitioning to a new school next year. I have friends that are moving and going to new roles, new schools, new countries. So it has me really thinking about identity and what that means to us as teachers and what the impact is on our daily well being. I think back a few years ago, I was 49 years old. I was a tenured professor. I was chair of my department. I'd been a professor for 12 years. I was very successful at my job. I had excellent reviews from students. I had won a teaching award from my university. I was pretty successful. I wasn't happy though. I found myself wanting more. I wanted some adventure. I wanted something new. I wanted some new challenges. When my last child moved out of the home and I found myself an empty nester, I decided to take a huge leap and go into international education. It had been a dream of mine for pretty much my entire life to live and work overseas. But as a single mom of three, it wasn't something that was really possible for me up until that point. So I did it. I sold my house. I sold almost everything that I own, and I moved to Korea. And it was a huge change, but it was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. It really made me think, though, about who I was because I had really identified as a professor. I'd been doing that for so long. 12 years is a long time. And because I was at the same university, working in the same school for so long, I had a reputation. I had presumed competence. People, they knew my name, they knew who I was, they knew that I was an expert in the things that I'm an expert in. It wasn't something that I had to really think about. It was. And then all of a sudden, I'm at a new school in a new country. I don't speak the language. I still don't speak more than a few words of Korean. I tried. I just couldn't do it. I'm not very good at languages apparently. But I was in a totally new setting. International schools are very different from national schools, so I had to learn how all of that works. Going back into a K-12 classroom after being a professor was an adjustment. I was really nervous about if I was gonna be able to make the adjustment, and I think I did. I think I made a fine adjustment and did a good job at it. But it really changed who I was and how I saw myself. I was lucky that at that first school, they did see me as an expert, and I was hired for my expertise, and I didn't have to prove to anybody that I knew what I knew about learning support. It was kind of assumed that I would know it. So that was helpful to me. That kind of bridged the gap a little bit. I did have to shift from professor to teacher, and that was a little bit of a change for me. Not a bad change, but just something that I had to learn how to shift. The schedule's a little bit different. As a professor, I did work very, very long hours. I actually worked more hours as a professor than I did as a teacher, but I was able to kind of pick the hours that I worked. I didn't have to actually be on campus unless I was teaching classes or had office hours. So I had to get used to that. I had to get used to being at the school from such and such time to such and such time, and it was fine, but I kind of missed my easy late mornings, but that's okay. So I made those shifts. My identity changed again, though, when I moved to a new school. So I went from Korea to another country and shifted into a bigger school. At that school, things were a little bit different. There was a leadership shift between the time I was hired and the time I started. And so the goals that the previous leadership, the ones that hired me, the goals they had for me had changed quite a bit. So I thought I was going into a position where I was again going to build systems and, do the kind of work that I was pretty much used to doing. And instead that shifted and I had to become a pretty passive teacher. And I wasn't really allowed to build systems and programs and all that stuff that makes my little brain buzz with happiness. So that was a shift for me. I also went from being respected and being seen as an expert to being in a position where my expertise was really frowned upon and actually mocked at times. So I had to learn how to um, just not offer suggestions and not say things. And that was very difficult for me to make that backward step. So all of that had me thinking about who am I? Because at first, when I moved to this school, it kind of hit me inside of am I worth something. Like, it actually hit my self-worth a little bit, and I realized how much that I had identified as the expert and how much I had identified as somebody that people came to when they had problems or questions. I was just used to that. I was pretty good at judging my performance myself. I am not somebody that needs a lot of external validation, but I did find that not having that identity as somebody who knows their stuff, that did get me at a deeper level. So I realized that I had to shift, and I had to shift who I was, and I had to shift what that identity meant to me and what the signals were that meant my identity. So all of that has happened in the last couple of years. A lot of us, if you ask who you are, a lot of you, if you're educators, you're going to say, I'm a teacher, I'm a principal, I'm a counselor. That's one of the things that you'll say first. You might also say, I'm a sister or a mother or a father. But who you are, your job title, for a lot of us, that is something that we identify with pretty strongly as educators. And that's not bad. It's okay to identify as a teacher. I am a teacher, no matter what role I'm in, whether I was an administrator or a professor or as a parent, I'm also a teacher. And so to me, that is a foundational identity. And that identity doesn't change no matter what my role is. I can go anywhere. Even someday when I retire, I will still identify as a teacher. That's separate from being a teacher at XYZ school. So it's okay to have that identity as a counselor or a principal because there's a lot that comes with that. But we do have to be careful about attaching it to a school. So if my identity becomes being a teacher at Excellence Academy, then that school has a lot of power over my self-worth and my well-being. Because if there's a leadership change or some other role change or something that happens that can touch that identity, it's going to touch my self-worth. And so that's one of the things we have to be careful with is that we keep some boundaries and separation there. If you are the literacy expert and you have a role change and you're no longer dealing with literacy, it's going to get your core well-being. If you are used to being the veteran that everyone relies on and you retire, that's going to hit because it's going to touch that identity piece that you have. So, thinking about what your identity is and separating that role from who you are is really important when you're going through transition. You don't want your identity to be tied to a specific context. It needs to be tied instead to your values and who you are. So, if you retire, a lot of you are retiring right now. There's a lot of people that they've hit their years and they're moving on, and there's excitement with that, but there's also a little bit of who am I? I felt the same when my last son moved out. At the one hand, it was like, wow, I can now, have the freedom to make this huge life change. But on the other hand, I was a mom for over 30 years between the three kids. And now, am I still a mom? What does that mean now when I don't have a child at home to take care of? So there's a transition that happens there. Yes, I'm still a mother. I still have my sons, but my role has absolutely changed because they're adults and they're independent. They don't need me in the same way they did when they were toddlers and young children. If you get a promotion, your role also changes. You become the newbie again. So if you were a really experienced teacher and you move into leadership, all of a sudden, all that comfort that you had of being an expert in your field as a teacher, you carry that with you. But now there's a whole new set of skills that you have to learn, and you become kind of the new one that has to figure it out and figure out how to make this work. How does it happen? So that can shift things. Relocations, if you're an international school teacher, a relocation can mean an entirely new country. When I moved from Korea to China, it was a pretty big difference. It's a different language, it's a different way of doing things, there's different norms, and so you have to navigate all of that stuff in addition to a new job. If you're in the US and you switch towns or cities or states, it's the same thing. It might not be as drastic as going from one country to another, but it could be. There's some parts of the US that feel like they're in a different country when you go from one place to another. So, depending on what that relocation means, that can also make a huge impact on you. Changing schools, even if you're an expert at your old school, when you go to the new school, again, you got to figure out how are things done here? Who do I talk to? Who do I go to? What's the process? So you have that discomfort of once again figuring everything out. I'm not looking forward to that next year. I'll have to do that. It's my least favorite part of moving to a school. I love meeting new people. I like the excitement of learning a new system, but I don't like not knowing where anything is and that initial frustration. I don't like it. I just have to deal with it and get over it. If you have a leadership transition, that's another huge thing that can impact your identity. You might stay at the same school, but you get a new principal. And so, even if that new principal is wonderful and great, they're going to have their own way of doing things, and you have to figure out how you interact with them. And your role with them might be different than it was with a previous principal. So all of these things can impact your identity and it can make you feel like part of you disappears sometimes. When I transitioned from my last school to this school and I lost that identity as an expert, as somebody that was respected, as somebody that you go to, I felt invisible in some ways. Now I still have that expertise, I still have that knowledge, and I still know what I have and what I bring to the table. But that feeling invisible, like nobody else saw it, that was a little of the struggle that I had to get through. So you might encounter this when you go through one of these role changes or transitions at your school. Sometimes you find yourself grieving the version that you used to be. So when you go through a transition, maybe it's a new job, and you might think, oh, I don't like this school or I don't like this town. It might not be the location, it might not be the job. You might be grieving who you were before. Humans, as much as we like excitement, and some of us like change more than others, there's always a little bit of a grief when you leave something that's comfortable and known for something that's unknown. There's excitement in it, but it's also a little bit difficult sometimes. And so you have to allow yourself that grieving process when you change and you shift. It's not always comfortable. So think about when we look at identity, we look at role, you really want to compare role versus identity because they're not the same thing. The identity is what is inside of you, and that's what you keep, and the role is the thing that changes. So when I was a professor, it wasn't a professor just because I worked at a university. It wasn't my role that was important to me. It wasn't the title even of professor. What was important to me and what's part of my identity and separate from that is being a teacher, a mentor, a learner, a problem solver, and a builder of people. That those were the parts of being a professor that I really liked and that I feel were part of me. And those parts come with me. It doesn't matter if other people see it or not. It doesn't matter what my role is. It doesn't matter what my title is. I am still a teacher, a mentor, a learner. I'm still all of those things. That doesn't change. It doesn't get taken away from me. It might look different in a different role, but that's still there. And so when we think of identity and we're going through these changes, we have to think, what is it? What are my core values? What are the core things that make me me? And that stays with you and that travels with you when you shift. So think about roles, skills, and values. Roles change. You're going to get different jobs, or you're going to get different leadership. You're going to work at a different grade level. Roles change. Those are fluid, and we really can't tie ourselves too closely to them because it's very unlikely that you're going to be in the same exact role for your entire career. Even if you manage to stay in fourth grade for the entire 20 years that you're a teacher, you're still going to have different types of roles within that. So from a new teacher to middle of the career teacher to a veteran teacher with different initiatives, different classes, all that. It changes. Roles change. They're very fluid. Skills transfer. So the skills stay. If you're a teacher, you're a teacher, you're a teacher, no matter where you are. Listening, facilitating, problem solving, those skills stay with you. So as you go to different roles, you're going to learn new skills and your toolbox gets bigger and it goes with you. That doesn't stay with the role. That always remains with you. And you never know when those skills come back up again as important and something that you need to use. The thing that endures the most is values. So your values, what makes you you, what makes you a great teacher or a great principal or a great professor or a great whatever you are, those are your values and those endure. They never go away. For me, I believe in service. That is a foundational value that I have. I like to be in schools where I'm allowed to express that. Sometimes I'm not in schools where I can express that and I have to move it into other areas of my life. But I really value service. That's something I have to have in my life. I value learning. I like to learn. I never stop learning. And so I'm always trying to learn new things. Sometimes that might be at the school, if I can do professional development or I can engage in PLCs or something where I get to learn, that's awesome. If I can't do that in my role, it's all right because I will find another way to learn. I'll find something else to stimulate my mind and grow. It doesn't have to be in my role. I also believe in compassion. I think it's important to have compassion for others, and that doesn't go away no matter where I'm living or what I'm doing. And I believe in growth. I really feel like you need to continue growing all the time. And I hope that I continue growing until my last day on this earth. So that is something else that I can do no matter what my role is. Even if I'm in a school that doesn't want me to grow and wants me to stay small, that's okay. I'll do that for you during the day. But then when I go home, I'm going to find other ways to grow and expand my mind. So those values stay and you can find other ways to express them if you're not able to do it in your current role. The closer your identity is to your values, the easier the transitions become. So if you think about it like a continuum with roles on one side and then skills and then values, you want to have your identity as close as possible to that values section because then no matter where you go, you still have that. If your identity is so closely tied to your roles, then when the role changes, you're like, and you go through this huge upheaval every time. So, my challenge to you is to try to really distill what your values are and really consciously think about that as part of your identity and who you are. There's a lot of fear in starting over. I have fear next year, starting at a new school. I'd have to stop and think how many times I've changed schools or roles over my career. There's been plenty. It's still scary to me. Even though I know it's gonna be okay, I can know all the logical things, it's still scary. When I moved from higher education into K-12 again, that was really scary. I had a lot of fears about if I was gonna be able to do it or not. That loss of reputation was hard, and it was scary, and I had to figure that out. I don't like feeling inexperienced, and you feel that when you go to a new school. So you have to like, I don't know how they're going to do things exactly there. I'm gonna have to figure that out. I have to kinda stand back and watch for a little while. You have to learn new systems. You have to learn how do I prove myself here? Do I want to prove myself here? So, what does success look like at this school? Because every school is different. The model I have of success doesn't match my current school's model of success. And so I had some difficulty with that because I was like, how I don't know how to succeed here because the way that I know doesn't match. And so you have to figure that out. And that's uncomfortable. That's part of transition and part of that starting over. Transition is growth. It feels like loss sometimes. And I will admit, when I moved into the current school, I did feel loss when I lost my reputation and all of that. There was a feeling of loss. But in reality, it turned into growth because I was able to refine my identity and I was able to push my creative outlets into other areas. I'm doing this podcast. I wrote a couple books. I found other ways that I could grow. And so, in some ways, for me, it was a blessing in disguise. All of that discomfort, the difficulty, it turned out to be a good thing because I found new ways to grow. And if you think about transition that way, it'll help. It helps you to get through some of the rough stuff. So think about these questions. My first question for you: what if transition isn't evidence that you lost your identity? So even though you transition into something else, what if that means that you don't lose your identity? What would that look like? How does your identity stay even if that transition wasn't what you expected? What if transition reveals what parts of you were real all along? So for me, that growth part. When I wasn't able to build systems and do that part of my job that I've been doing for literally decades and I really enjoy, I was floundering. I'm like, "What do I do? Like, what do I do? That I'm so used to doing this." And so I found out that it wasn't building systems in particular schools that really got me excited. It was actually building frameworks. And so when I was like, that is what I really care about, and it doesn't have to be in the school, I wrote a book. So think about what part of you is real that you don't need to have in this role that you can channel someplace else. Maybe it's a side hustle. Maybe it's a new hobby. Maybe it's mentoring somebody. Think about what it is that's really real that you can push into some other area of your life. And what if the role is not the only expression of who you are? It's only one expression. When I was a professor, that was such a huge part of who I was. The other parts of my life, I don't think really grew as much as they could have. So through this transition that I've made with moving to these new schools, I've learned that that's only one piece of me. Working in a school is one piece. And so all these other parts of my life have now grown. And so think about that. Maybe what parts of your life do you need to grow a little bit more because you've put all your eggs into the role bucket? So how do you shift that? Sometimes going through transition, starting in new schools, sometimes I felt like an outsider. I want to talk about that a little bit. I have felt like an outsider a lot through my career because I came to teaching in a little bit of a non traditional way. I came from a background of poverty. I didn't come from a family that had college graduates and all of that. That wasn't something that my family valued education, but we didn't have a lot of grads. I was a single mom at 18. So when I was in school, in college, I was a mom and I was trying to juggle that. I always felt like, do I really belong here, even in my teaching program? As a teacher, I felt like I always did things a little bit differently. Looking back, I can see that I was using a trauma informed approach before we even knew what that was. And that was a little bit different than what everybody else was doing. But I'm glad now that I was doing that. I'm glad that I followed my instincts with that. When I moved to international schools, I did have a couple people kind of say, "Oh, you don't understand how it works here. You're from the US." And so some of my ideas and thoughts were dismissed for that. I didn't like that. And so that made me feel like an outsider too of, do I belong here? I'm older than a lot of the teachers that are starting out in international education. That made me feel like an outsider. So sometimes we have things that make us feel like, I don't know if I belong. And belonging is a really essential part of being a human. And so when you don't feel that, it can also impact your well being. So, what you need to do is if you feel like that outsider, you need to think about your identity and you need to put your heart into that identity. So, yes, I don't have the same experience everybody else does in international schools, but I'm also a really good teacher. And I also know how to build systems, and I'm also a good mentor. So it's okay if some people are going to dismiss me because they think I'm not part of their little group. That's all right. I know who I am. So when you have that solid identity, it helps you to not feel so much like an outsider. Or if you do feel like an outsider, it helps you not to care as much. And it helps you to keep moving forward. And it takes away the power of other people to shame you. Some people will make you feel like an outsider because it's a way to control and manipulate. And so if they can't do that, they can't control you. So you have your identity inside of you and it's based on things that are not related to your role or whatever the norms are of the groups that you're in. All right, couple questions as we get close to the end here. I'd like you to think about what parts of your identity are tied to your current role. So think about, even if you're not making a transition, start thinking about this so that you can start pulling that identity back inside yourself and it's not so tangled up with your role. What parts are tied to that current role? What parts would still be true if your title changed tomorrow? If you get the news that you have to move to a new school or you're moving to a new grade or you're no longer going to be principal, you're now going to be an assistant principal. If somebody changed your title, what parts of you stay? And what do you want to carry with you into your next season? So, whether you're transitioning now or maybe it's going to be a couple years from now, what are the parts of you that you want to make sure you hang on to because you want to bring those with you? Think about these questions as you help form your identity and pull that back inside yourself where it's in a nice, safe, secure place. Next week, I'm going to bring in some friends who are navigating transitions of their own. I have two friends that are actually going to different countries. One is moving from a counseling position back into hopefully a teaching position. He hasn't secured one yet, but that's the goal. And I have another friend who is leaving the classroom and starting her own education technology business. So we're going to talk to them and about what that means for them as they transition hugely into different countries, different roles, and some of the uncertainty that they're facing in their future. So, we're going to talk about that. Until next time, notice what remains when the titles change, name the values that travel with you, and remember the role may change, but who you are goes with you.